Right back where we started this morning, Matthew 27, I guess, we're getting into, as well as Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 18, but we'll be moving into John 19 as well. In our lesson this morning, we saw the Jewish trial of Jesus, the, mock trial, Peter's denials of Jesus, and now we move on to the Roman portion of the trial. We have to remember that the Jews were not allowed to pronounce the death sentence. And again, it's been recorded at least that had been the case since 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, which happens to be the year that they're in right now, the year AD 30. I did not know that until I was studying for this, it was so close to around that time that that rule was put into place. And so they were going to have to present this case to the Romans, to Pilate, who was the more or less what we would call a governor, I guess, of that region. And one thing that I didn't really mention this morning, I should have emphasized, is just how un-Jewish even the whole Jewish trial was in itself. They were breaking their own laws and their own principles by doing what they were doing. A case like that would be able to be tried only in the regular meeting place of the Sanhedrin, with the full council, not at the high priest's palace. They weren't allowed to begin at nighttime or even in the afternoon. So they broke both of those so far. And they weren't allowed to do it on the Sabbath day or feast days or even on the eves of those days, which this is getting pretty close to that, especially if we're taking this to be Friday, as our study does. And in any case, at a regular Jewish trial, or a regular trial, the Jewish judges, no matter how prejudiced they were, it's been said they would not have acted anything like what these Sanhedrists and Caiaphas, the way they behaved on this occasion. So the whole thing was disgraceful from top to bottom, not just by our standards of a trial, but even by their standards of a trial. And now they're going to be taking it to the Romans for this, whose system of law was pretty, even by our standard, pretty good. Ours, if you think our legal system is the greatest that it's ever been, well, you can thank the Romans for that, because we got ours pretty much ultimately from theirs. So it's just interesting to think about how on that night, all the enmity and evil that man could come up with, and even under the false testimony, they still couldn't lay any crime on Jesus. Even they had liars come up to specifically to make up testimony against him, and they still had nothing except to misrepresent and twist something that he had said. That was all they had. And yet, if that's not amazing enough, that was going to prove to be enough to actually get him killed. It's just there's so many elements involved in this whole case. Whenever Jesus told his disciples that he would be taken and killed, they were already thrown off and couldn't believe it. But whenever he said he would be crucified, that was just, there's no way that could happen. No, never. He had never, even if he wasn't the God-man, he had never done any crime, never committed a sin, much less never committed a crime. And yet, he's going to be crucified? There's just no way this could happen. And even at this point, we think there's no way they're going to pull this off, because they have nothing. And surely, an outsider like Pilate would never allow this to go on. And yet, that's the stage we're in at this point, beginning this Roman phase of the trial. The next morning, it seems, they lead Jesus to the praetorium, But we have to keep in mind, they didn't lead him there as a prisoner who had already been condemned to death, because they couldn't do that. They had already decided that is what needed to happen. But they weren't necessarily taking Jesus to Pilate to ask him to kill him. They were taking him there as one that had been accused of things that made him worthy of death by their standard, but not as someone they had already condemned to death, or else that would have put them sort of in the hot seat, since they weren't allowed to do that. And on one hand, we're sort of looking at more of a history lesson at this point, and yet, as we look at this, we can't help but be moved, hopefully, and touched by how much He loves us. Because underneath all this is He did this of His own will for us. So even though we're looking at things that happened, and not necessarily teachings or anything like that, but looking at the life of Jesus in general is enough to change somebody's life. Should be, anyway. Anybody have any questions or anything about some of the stuff we looked at this morning, or the Jewish part?
But when you think about the word history, which we all use, and you understand the providence of God, that's what this all is a story of Jesus until He comes again. We are part of His story. I mean, it's amazing that our language acknowledges His greatness, and that He is the Alpha and the Omega.
That's what He is. I mean, if we think about it, if Jesus was what they said He was, He deserved to die on the cross. But if He is what He said He was, then we're right to worship Him, and everybody should. So He is the Christ, the Son of the living God, the Savior of mankind. Those are the only two options, really. So every person has to decide which one they think He is. And I've made this point many times, it seems like, that you can't just settle that, well, He was a good man, He was a teacher, he did some good things, had some good teachings, but He wasn't the Son of God. You can't, that doesn't work, because He said He was the Son of God. He said He came from God. And so He's either what they said He is or what He says He is, and everybody chooses. And sometimes there are many people who choose one when they think they've chosen the other. They usually, obviously, some people think they've chosen to believe that He is the Son of God, and yet by their actions and lives, they've actually chosen, they believe the other. So we have to be careful about which one we choose, but everybody makes a choice of whether they think Jesus is what His enemies said He is or what He said that He is. And everything that He said and did proves that what He said is the truth, even to these people. And like Paul said, they knew that He was who He said He was. There's no way they could deny it, and they didn't even try to deny His works. They just tried to twist the source of His power, which was a pretty feeble attempt. So, Luke 23, John 18, either one of those will be correct. Starting in verse 2 of Luke 23, it says, I'll just start in verse 1. Then the whole company of them arose and brought Him before Pilate. And they began to accuse Him, saying, We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. This is the last thing we looked at this morning. And saying that He Himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked Him, Are you the king of the Jews? And He answered him, You have said so. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they were urgent, saying, He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place. John 18, 28 says, They led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him." So, Pontius Pilate is the man of the hour in a sense. He was the Roman governor who was over Judea and Samaria. And his whole purpose, he wasn't Caesar obviously, but the whole purpose of men like him and his position and other regions was to keep the peace and to collect taxes for Rome from these regions. And he also had the job, as our lesson points out, of approving and carrying out the execution of anyone sentenced to death by the people's own government. And in this case, it would have been the Sanhedrin. So the Jews bring Jesus, and as I pointed out, they didn't say that they had condemned him to death. They said, this man needs to be, he's been doing evil. So he asked what's he done? He said, they didn't answer. Notice, they didn't answer him. They said, if he wasn't doing evil, we wouldn't have brought him here. And, it's like Pilate could have said, that wasn't my question. That's not what I asked. What has he done? What evil has he done? But instead, he takes him in and questions him himself. First, he says, take him and judge him by your own law. I shouldn't have been bothered with this. You have your own system, your own law. And that was kind of a gracious thing for the Romans to have done for the Jews, even, excluding the death penalty. They were able to judge such things according to their own law. But this is where they sort of added another layer to this. It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. They hadn't mentioned anything about putting to death at this point. So Pilate didn't seem to think this was such a serious thing, and their answer didn't give that idea because they didn't even have an accusation against him. But they revealed now they wanted to put him to death, and they needed him for that. So he decided he needed to question Jesus himself. Are you the king of the Jews? That was what they said. He says, why are you asking me that? Did you come up with that, or did you hear somebody say that about me? And then he goes forward and says, my kingdom is not of this world. And isn't this interesting? Here's his reasoning that proves that what he was saying about his kingdom not being of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting to keep me from being delivered over to the Jews. Now, we don't have to think back very far to remember the moment when he was being delivered over to the Jews. And I'm pretty sure at least one of his servants was fighting. Weren't they? Good old Peter. Lord, shall we strike with the sword? Never mind, don't answer. Here I go. And then he does that. Isn't it amazing? This sort of brings up to our memories or our minds, may make us think about the fact that that never gets brought up, ever, in this whole thing. Peter had given the enemies of Jesus the greatest piece of evidence in this case that they could have ever hoped to have. On a silver platter, by drawing that sword and using brutal force, or physical force at least, in Jesus' defense.
But then he miraculously healed the guy, so if they did bring that up, that's going to go against them because it's just going to prove that he's...
Exactly. What Jesus did made it so that they could not really bring it up. It would be very difficult to bring up what Peter did without somehow uncovering what Jesus did. And they don't want to bring that up. That would be the worst thing to bring up. So it's just interesting that it never gets brought up. And I don't know if the Jews could hear him. It seems that they were more or less in private here. But especially if they could have heard, this is where they would have said, oh, wait, Mr. Governor, his servants did fight. But no, they were probably in private. But either way, it never gets brought up. That was their greatest gift that Peter could have given them to try to strengthen their case, because they've got nothing. They would have taken anything. And Peter gave them a gift, but it never gets brought up because Jesus reversed what he did and sort of made it to where they couldn't bring it up. They couldn't bring that up. So it's interesting that Jesus says that. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting. But they weren't fighting. They tried, but he made them stop. And they didn't start again. He says, my kingdom is not from the world. He says, oh, so you are a king then. He says, you say that I'm a king. He says, I was born and have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. And everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. It almost seems like as he walked away or something. There's a map if you want to look at that. Don't know how much value there is in it, but on the website it has, I've zoomed this in quite a bit, but this is considered a general possibility of the path that was taken from the garden, and then here's the house, maybe the houses of Caiaphas and Annas, and then where does it go from there? Temple. Anyway, there it is. Yes.
You know, for humans, when emotion and experience take precedent over the word of truth, this is how you get in a mess. When Pilate came out and said, behold, the man, in their mind, they had heard of a God with which they couldn't even approach the mountain that he was on.
Mm-hmm.
There was a God that had revealed himself in fire and flame and all of this. And now here is a man who claims to be God. So if they had heard all this time he was teaching that he was the Son of God, proving that he was the Son of God, separating his spiritual role from his earthly role, they would have known, but they never listened.
Yep, and Jesus called them out for it. And he said, if you were of my Father, you wouldn't be acting like this. You would believe me. But you cannot tolerate what I'm saying because you can't bear to hear my words. You cannot, it's not in you to accept the truth, basically. And it's a sad state for a person to be in, but they were in that state. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. These are all things that Pilate was not interested in. For him to say something like that, I was born and have come into the world for the purpose of bearing witness to the truth, and everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. What does Pilate care about that? This sounds like the ramblings of a pious, monk or something. This doesn't concern him. And then he sort of mutters, what is truth anyway? And he goes back out and he says, I don't find any guilt in this man. He seems a little crazy, but that's not a crime. I don't know if he thought that about him, but, he probably wasn't a man who was interested in any kind of religious, spiritual talk of any kind. It's also, isn't it ironic that the Jews' way of execution was by stoning, usually, and yet the Jews were the ones who were trying to get Jesus killed, but Jesus said that he was going to be crucified. And that just creates further obstacles about how that word is going to be fulfilled, because the Romans are the ones that do the crucifixion. And now everything is just playing out, and just again leaves us in awe of the nature of prophecy. Just like with Peter and the others running, even though they were willing to fight, and they did fight, but then they ended up running anyway because the way things played out. Here, John says, was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. It wasn't too much later that the Jews didn't have any problem picking up stones and killing Stephen with no trial at all. They were so fired up that they killed him right there on the spot. It kind of makes us wonder how that didn't ever happen with Jesus, except for the fact that that wasn't the manner of death he was to die. And this is what played out instead. So even a bystander, in the whole big picture anyway, like Pilate, even he's playing his part. Don't make the mistake of cutting Pilate too much slack. I've made that mistake in the past, but we're going to see as this progresses. Pilate he maybe was worth a little more integrity, had a little more integrity than they did, but he was no innocent bystander. He was not sinless in this. And that'll become pretty clear. So, my kingdom is not of this world, was what he said. What is truth? Pilate says, I found no guilt in him. But that stirred up the crowd. Obviously, that's not something they want to hear, because that from Pilate means, I'm done with this. Sorry, not doing anything about it. Keep me out of this. That stirred them up. Luke's account in chapter 23, verse 5 says they started to press Pilate even harder. They were urgent. And they again said, he's been stirring up the people from Judea all the way to Galilee, even here in this city. Well, that triggered something in Pilate's mind. Wait, you say Galilee? So he asked if Jesus was a Galilean. He learned that he was. So he's like, hallelujah. That's Herod's territory. That means this is out of my hands. He should be heard by Herod. So he sends him to Herod. Getting ahead again. Now, we don't know where Herod was at the time or why he was where he was, but he seems to have been close by. He was in Jerusalem. We don't know where he was staying, but he was in town. He just happened to be in town. Perfect. This could not have worked out better. Pilate was probably so relieved because he found out Jesus was a Galilean. This gives him a way to get himself out of this. I'm going to send him to Herod. He's under Herod's jurisdiction, and Herod just happens to be in town. Probably because it was Passover week and the Herods were supposedly Jews, even though they weren't really. So he sends him to Herod. Herod seems to have been quite a character. The name Herod in general, it's not a name, but anybody who had the name Herod or the title Herod, horrible reputation. And it's not all because of Granddaddy Herod, Herod the Great. He helped, but they were all what a family this was. I can't imagine their Thanksgiving dinners at the Herod family. But the family reunion, you want to be miles and miles away when that's going on. They were not great people, to say the least. So Herod, it says he's glad. He was glad to see Jesus. Why was he glad to see Jesus? I don't know. Other than the fact that it says he had long desired to see him. Why do you want to see him? Doesn't seem to have been for any good reason. But it does seem to suggest it was because he wanted to see him do some kind of trick. He wanted to see some signs. He wanted to see some sort of marvel. And, as far as that goes, can't really blame him, because I don't think we can deny that we would probably be right there with him. We would want to see something. But this is why he wanted to see Jesus. He hadn't seen Jesus before, apparently, but now he's very glad because he'd been wanting to see a sign. I've heard about things this guy's said to have done. I want to see it. So this was Pilate's way out. It says, Herod questioned him at some length. We don't really have an insight to some of these questions. What we do have insight to is that he made no answer. Not a word. He questioned Jesus at length. Jesus answered not a single word. That is about as good of a testimony about Herod as we can hope to get. The fact that Jesus did not answer him a word, I think, says more about Herod than it does, as much about Herod as it does Jesus. But the chief priests and the scribes were there, vehemently accusing him, it says. So then Herod, because of this, and probably because Jesus had insulted him by not answering and making him look like a fool, I guess. It says, Luke 23:11 says, Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then arraying him in splendid clothing, sent him back to Pilate to be as a joke. He claimed to be a king. We're going to dress him up like a king and send him back to Pilate. So then he gets back to Pilate. Probably, if finding out Jesus was a Galilean made Pilate's day, this ruined his day. He was probably hoping he wasn't going to have to see Jesus again and deal with this. But now, here he is. But here's the thing. Imagine, here's Jesus. He arrives back, and he's dressed in this mocking way, which would obviously indicate that he had been mocked further, not just by the clothes, but by the things they were doing. And a lot of men in Pilate's position would have been disgusted by this and thought this is a disgrace. This man did not deserve this treatment. But what Luke tells us is this, that Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day. For before this, they had been in enmity with each other. Pilate and Herod did not like each other, had a long-standing hatred for each other, it seems. But on this very day, they became friends. There's Pilate, Pontius Pilate. That's who he is. He's not this man of great integrity and moral character that tried every single thing he possibly could to get Jesus off the hook and doesn't deserve any of the blame. It was all the Jews, and Pilate did what he had to do. No, he didn't. He didn't have to. He could have sent Jesus off. He said, I find no guilt in him. That should have been the end of it. But it was Pilate's weakness and his nature as a politician, I guess, to feel the need to do something so that these scoundrels don't cause trouble or something. I don't know. But Luke 23:12 shows us what kind of man Pilate was. He could have been even more angry with Herod at this point because he hoped to not see Jesus again, and now he's sending him back. But they became friends that day, even though they hated each other, simply because of apparently what he did to Jesus. I don't see any other, unless there's some other detail that they don't mention that happened that day that made them friends, which kind of makes it seem like Luke inserted an irrelevant point. That was what made them friends. But now he's back where he started. So, like we said, one of the things that that Pilate had the responsibility to do, was to keep the peace. And of course, he didn't want the Jews to be stirred up to a riot, but that doesn't mean that Jesus should have to pay the price because they were threatening to start a riot. If he was a man of integrity, he would have done the right thing no matter what the cost, even if it would have reflected back on him, even if he would have been deposed for not keeping the peace. Right is right, period. But he did not act in the best interest of what is right. He acted in the best interest of Pilate. So, we're going to save the last part, the last stage of the Roman trial for our next lesson. Shouldn't rush through it anyway. So much is there for us to reflect on and think about and consider. But not the least of which is this. Jesus was totally innocent. Pilate said, I find no guilt in this man. If Pilate only knew how true that was, which he didn't, but if he only knew. He found no guilt in him. There was no guilt in him. Not one single thing. And that has application to our lives. He was totally innocent and there was no guilt in him. Then why did he suffer this? Why is this happening? Because he chose for it to happen. He didn't just go to Jerusalem for this to happen. He came to earth for this to happen. All because of us. Because he wanted us to be able to live in eternity with him, basically. Sin must be punished. But he made it a way for sin to be punished without the sinner being punished. By walking in the steps he's walking right now in this study. Jesus is a king, but he's not a king of this world. His kingdom's not of this world. He's a spiritual king. And he ought to be the king of our lives. But his kingdom isn't of this world. It doesn't operate by the principles of this world. It's different. We have to make a decision about Jesus. Pilate tried to brush him aside. Sometimes we try to do that too. But it'll always come back. We can't push our decision of Jesus on others either. Every single person has to decide for himself. So what will you do with Jesus? He isn't guilty, but we are. And yet he willingly endured all of this and so much more that we haven't even gotten into yet. So that you could be pronounced innocent. Mm-hmm.
I think as humans, we have a hard time understanding how horrible sin is to God. But when you look at who was released instead of Jesus, that's us. I mean, we're Barabbas.
Yeah.
And we were released. And I'm sure he called him, behold your king, in mocking all the Jews and Jesus, just by calling him king.
Yeah.
Not realizing, no, he really is. I mean, he tells him, you'd have authority if I didn't give it to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pilate wasn't a big fan of the Jews either, at this point. But he didn't have anything personal against Jesus except that he gave him all this trouble. And that's a pretty selfish way to look at it, don't you think? He didn't do anything wrong. The Jews are the ones that gave him this trouble by bringing him there. But as far as Pilate was concerned, Jesus is just as bad as they are because they are the reason why he's having to deal with this. But yeah, calling Jesus King of the Jews was definitely a mockery of them. And yet he was totally fine with Jesus being put to death if it's going to help him, not to get in trouble or to be deposed or whatever it may have been. But little did he know, the only reason he's able to put Jesus to death is because Jesus led him. And the only reason Jesus wanted that to happen is for you. Yeah, Barabbas, as despicable as he seems, haven't even gotten to Barabbas yet. But yeah, we may as well be Barabbas. The guilty set free so that the innocent or the innocent condemned so the guilty could be set free. That's us. So how's our life going to reflect that? Hopefully it reflects it always, but we have to make a decision, and today's the best time to make that decision.